In this episode, I have the pleasure of talking to Joe from Greyhawk Grognard. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, I need you to fill me in on what I don't know, which is everything, about the Greyhawk setting, because I discovered you recently when I was looking into the Vecna's new book. And initially, I thought it was pronounced Oerth, the planet or whatever, but you say it Orth, is that right?
Yeah, Gary Gygax, who invented the setting, actually called it Oith with this kind
Oh,
of Bugs Bunny accent. And the story goes that he did it that way just to poke a hole in people who took their fantasy gaming too seriously. So I call it Orth, or it kind of varies depending on my mood. Um, but I can't bring myself to use Gary's pronunciation of it, but I try on a lot of other things.
so in the book, I noticed it said it's in the Isle of Serpents on the Asperdi Does Chan chain. Can you fill me in on that?
Yeah, that is a chain of islands on the eastern side of the Flyness, which is on this map you see behind me.
Mm.
It would be about here. There's the thing about the setting in terms of the geography. It's the Flyness, which is what you see behind me, is sort of analogous to Europe in that it is a projection off of a much larger continent called Oerk. There's a bunch of islands and so forth. One of the good things about the setting is that it presents a large variety of different terrain types to make adventuring easier for the DM, because if you need to go to a desert or a forest or mountains or swamps or whatever, you generally don't have to travel all that far before you can hit that kind of terrain. So it's very much consciously designed to help the DM in that kind of respect.
Yeah. So is it? What's the setting like? Is it swords and sandals? Is it? Are we talking really stripped back low magic?
No, it's actually, I consider it a low magic setting on the whole. And there are places like the Greyhawk dungeons, obviously, where it's a very high magic setting and very hot fantasy-ish. But the setting as a whole, as he presented it, because he wrote a series of novels set in the setting. And it's very instructive to look at those novels to get an idea of how he perceived his own setting, where there are most of the villains and other things that you interact with in the setting are humans or demi-humans. There's very few actual monsters per se, and there's very few very high-level magic items as compared to some other settings, which like the Forgotten Realms, which has a proliferation of magic. It's almost ubiquitous throughout the setting. In Greyhawk, things tend to be a little more muted. Like I say, there's spikes here and there. There are obviously high level magic users, and there's very powerful artifacts and so forth. The artifacts that you see in the DM's guide, the original DM's guide, actually came from his campaign. So there are things of power in there, but it's not nearly as commonplace as it is in some other settings, and so it gives a kind of a grounded feel. You get these the feeling that it's much more akin to a Dark Ages or early Middle Ages Europe, especially in the sense that there are wars going on, which is something you don't really see in a lot of other in a lot of other settings. Large scale wars with armies moving around. He wrote a series of articles in Dragon Magazine, again in the setting, explaining this is what's happening. This nation raised this many troops and they fought a battle here and so forth. So again, it feels much more grounded to me when you have those kinds of details that bring it closer to our real world history than something that's purely fantastical and is feels a little more fantasy-esque.
And is it the purity? Is that the reason you've stuck to it because it was the original sort of?
Well, I mean, obviously, over the years, as more books have been produced and things like that, they've, a lot more detail has been added. I like it because it's, even though a lot of additional material has accreted to the setting over the years, it's still not overwhelming. It's still approachable to a new person who hasn't grown up with the setting like I did, because there's not that much to assimilate. In fact, the original book that came out when the setting was first published, for an entire kingdom, you'd only get a paragraph or two to describe it. It's almost Hemingway-esque in its brevity. And I really like, because it gives a lot of room for the dungeon master to fill in the corners and fill in the gaps. It's very easy to improvise when you're in the world of Greyhawk, because every little thing isn't nailed down, every little detail isn't recorded somewhere. There's not 1,000 novels to read and take in, unlike, again, the Forgotten Realms, which, in my opinion, just kind of floods you with information. I would never be able to run a game in Forgotten Realms, because I'd be terrified that I would be contradicting something that was already established and would become very important later on. The chances of that are much lower in Greyhawk, because there just isn't that much there. It's designed, again, consciously to be an aid and an inspiration for the dungeon master, rather than something that you have to fit your concepts in and around a lot of other detail.
Yes, because it's patchy in that you fill in your blanks, so your Greyhawk is your Greyhawk, basically.
Exactly, very much so. And there are people who play Greyhawk, without Dungeons and Dragons. There are people who've done it with Tunnels and Trolls. I know people have used GURPS Greyhawk. So it's also not tied so specifically to a single game system. One of the sayings in the Greyhawk community is editions change, Greyhawk endures, because it doesn't matter if it's first edition or fifth edition. Greyhawk kind of remains immutable in that sense, and part of that, I think, is because it is relatively less detailed, and I think that really helps in that respect.
Yeah. Do you think the people who play Greyhawk are much more holding the setting tightly as compared to, Forgotten Realms? Do you think it's like, this is what we started and we're not going to let it die? I mean, it's coming back anyway.
Well, yeah, the Greyhawk community has been absolutely carrying a torch during the dark times when Greyhawk wasn't being published very much. It is, I think, important to have that kind of passionate fan community. And it really does help, when you have people like myself or like a number of other people who are creating new things for Greyhawk, even though it's been largely forgotten by Wizards of the Coast. But as you say, it is coming back. They are going to be giving some official support to it, which is going to be a good thing in terms of bringing new people in to learn about the setting. So new people just in general is a good thing. It remains to be seen just how much they will change the setting as they do that, as they have with other settings that they've brought back for the 5th edition era. But, there's no way to tell what those changes are going to be until we see what they are.
Yeah. Can I just ask, what D&D edition is your favourite? Are you going back to the first, or...?
Right. I played first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons with my own Adventures Dark and Deep material added on. But I've also played second. I've played fifth. I kind of skipped over third and fourth. And, fifth edition is a good game. I have some specific issues with it. I don't think it scales very well for a long-term campaign. Little things. It's not, I certainly don't bear it the white hot hatred of 1,000 suns that some people do. I do prefer first edition. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but in my mind, the genius of first edition is that it is a series of interconnected modules almost that you can change around independently without breaking something. So, for example, what we used to do back in the day, we would play, we would call it Dungeons and Dragons. We would use the magic system from Chivalry and Sorcery, and we'd use the combat system from Arms Law and Claw Law, and it was still D&D, and it still worked all together. Whereas more modern systems, because they have those integrated systems, if you change something over here, you're very likely to break something over here without realizing. And first and second editions are much better in that regard, because there is, it's made up of semi-independent systems that you can swap out and tinker with. And I like to tinker, so that, you know, it's much better from that perspective.
Yeah, you know, when I watch your channel and when I listen to you talk and tell me about these systems that I have no idea what they are, I just hope that I become like you one day, that, you know, I wax lyrical about 5e and how things used to be, and the fact that, you know, your intro is showing all your old modules, the thin booklets. I don't know, it's something so exciting about it, you know, the fact that you actually physically have those books, and there was not many pages to a lot of them, was there?
No, in fact, you get like a classic module. I think it was the first module, Hall of the Steading of the Hill Giant Chief. It's only like 12 pages long for a 3-level dungeon. And it's, you know, and it's again, like I said before, its brevity really helps the DM because it doesn't overwhelm you, and it gives a lot of little inspiration here and there. And that's sort of the genius of the way that Gygax was writing, where he gives very evocative descriptions of things that aren't very long, but they take your mind and they spin off ideas, you know, as you read it, which I think works perfectly for this kind of game, because a lot of the game, at least the way I play it, requires improvisation. Not only on the part of the players, but on the part of the DM, because if the players go off on some tangent that you hadn't thought of, or that isn't covered in a written module, then you have to instantly think on your feet and adapt. And I think that's one of the things also I don't like about 5e, is that a simple adventure module is a 128-page book, because they think they need to cover so much and give so much detail. To me, that feels very confining. You know, but that's personal preference, and that's just style of play. You know, it's the way I was brought up to play the game.
You know, in the original modules, did they do the same thing where they actually told you what the DCs were? Because I don't know if we need DCs. Did you make them up yourself?
We didn't have DCs.
Wow.
And there was no game balance. Really wasn't that big of a concern.
Yeah.
You know, it was the part of the harsh lessons of early versions of D&D was the players have to learn. Sometimes you got to run away. You know, if a first level character meets an ogre, you got to turn tail and run, and or even better, you have to negotiate with it, because you will lose a battle. And a lot of that has also been lost. And to be fair, that was a lot of that was lost back in the 80s as well. People didn't realize that the DM has to give the players an opportunity to interact even with a monster. You know, if you look at some of the random encounter tables for wildernesses in the original game, you could easily meet a horde of 200 orcs just by, you know, random rolls, and in that kind of situation, or like 50 bandits. In that kind of situation, you obviously can't attack, and you have to kind of fast talk your way through the encounter. And I think that was, again, a deliberate choice, because in Gygax's conception, you know, it wasn't all about just find the monster, kill it, and take its stuff. You wanted to get your objectives, hopefully without combat. And I think that's also why in the earliest editions of D&D, you got experience points for gold pieces, because you didn't necessarily have to kill the monster. You would get just as much XP if you distracted the monster while one of your other party members got the treasure. And, you know, I think that attitude encourages a lot more creativity than every encounter is you roll dice.
Yeah, interesting. So do you have favorite modules?
Oh, yes. Oh, I do. My absolute favorite is Temple of Elemental Evil, the T1 through 4. I've written and done a lot of videos about it. It is so evocative. I actually bought the first copy ever sold from when I was at Gen Con back in the 80s. And it was signed by Gary Gygax. And over the years, I had to sell it at one point. So I'm kicking myself for that. I could have just gone without some meals or skipped a rent payment. But it is very rightly called Greyhawk's starting zone. Because you have the village of Hamlet, which is very well detailed. But again, there's only a paragraph or two, but they're very evocative of the inhabitants of the village and and the Inn of the Welcome Wench and so forth. And there's a little mini dungeon called the Moat House, where you meet some bandits, and they're actually agents of the temple. And so it kind of draws you in that way. And one of the things that's so good about it is that it does, it brings the players into the setting, because the politics of the setting actually have a real impact on the adventure itself. It's not just an isolated dungeon where you go in and it's completely removed from its environment. It matters that this person worships this deity, or this person is a druid, or this person works for this kingdom. And all that stuff is there deliberately because it does have a connection to the setting. It's built into the history. It's specifically mentioned, some of the background stuff is specifically mentioned in the original Greyhawk Folio. So it does tie into everything. The dungeon itself is really well done, but it really needs several readings to come together. And I'm still discovering new stuff about it from reanalyzing the text and looking at it from different perspectives and so forth. There's tons of little details here and there that really pay off if you pay attention.
Has that been reissued for 5th?
It was by Goodman Games. They did a whole series of reissues of old modules. That was one of them. They're all out of print now, but I think you can still get them on eBay and so forth, and they're not astronomical yet. Give it time. They will be. But yeah, they did 5th edition conversions, and they added some new material of the wilderness around it and so forth. And I have it down there.
Yeah. So, Tomb of Horrors?
Oh, yeah.
That's original Greyhawk, correct?
Correct. Although that one is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, where it is very self-contained. And at least when it was originally published, it didn't have to be in a particular place, and it didn't have a broader connection. Later on in other modules, they did they made more connections with the Demi-Lich to other things, and turned him into a bigger villain across the setting. But originally, it was. They actually gave several different locations that it could be in, and then it kind of gradually migrated in the fan consciousness into one of those locations in the Great Swamp. But it's it's rightfully one of the classic modules. And obviously it's got a reputation for being a meat grinder, and I've run it at conventions relatively recently, and even people who've read the module still can't get through it. So it's a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, I've not done the original, but I know in Tales from the Yawning Portal they reissued it and reworked it, and apparently it's still a bit broken, it's still difficult. But then Tomb of Annihilation, the module, ends in what seems to be another upgrade of it, but it's like a 4 or 5 level dungeon, and I killed all my players twice in that. I gave them all
I don't consider that broken, because that was kind of the point of the module. Gygax reportedly wrote it because he got tired of people saying, I've got a 75th level ranger and I'm invincible. So he wrote this module to run them through it and take them down a peg. Yeah. So it's fulfilling its function in that respect.
Well, when I met Luke Gygax at a convention a few weeks ago, and he was telling the crowd that he'd sort of pester his dad to, can we play D&D tonight? And he had a paladin or something, and he said he was like level 21. Was he level 21? Maybe that's just comparative to 5e. So he had it a long time, he was attached to it, pestered his dad, and Gary Gygax is like, okay, we'll play. And he ran Tomb of Horrors for him and just mincemeated his... as a bad lesson to him. Like, well, you asked. You pestered me. So I saw you mentioning orcs recently and how they're not as good anymore. What's your beef with orcs?
Oh, I don't know. They seem to be moving in a direction, and again, it's hard to say definitively because we haven't seen the text of the new books. But from some of the art that they've released, they seem to be moving away from the idea that orcs are just inherently evil war machine who are there as foes for the players and the forces of good. They seem to be, based on a couple pieces of art that have been released and some things that a couple of people have said, they seem to be softening the orcs and making them more human-like, more sympathetic. Nothing is evil, and nothing. Well, I should say nothing is inherently evil, and I disagree with that as a design choice in general. Not specifically around orcs, but although the recent artwork of the orcs with the matador hats and things like that was just baffling. But in general, I think that you lose a lot in terms of the mythic foundations of the game. In fact, I did a whole video about this not too long ago. When you lose the idea of there being objective evil and objective good, I think you lose something on a mythic level. And the game, at its best, works at that mythic level where the PCs are the heroes. They are the forces of good and right and order and society, fighting against the forces of evil and chaos and the disillusion of society. And I know why modern audiences want to see that kind of move away from objective morality. But from a game, and I'm not getting into that debate, but from a game perspective, I think the game works best when there is the assumption of that objective morality, especially when you have entire planes of existence like the Nine Hells or the Abyss or the Seven Heavens or Gladsheim that are literally embodiments of specific alignments. And to get away from the idea that these alignments exist and these alignments are relevant and that they inform the basis of the mythic journey the game embodies, I think you really lose something in the game when you do that. And the thing with the orcs is just one symptom of that larger problem.
Yeah, almost making them Disney characters, like like a friendly giant.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So yeah, this whole Vecna Eve of Ruin single chapter. Well, I'm not going to spoil, but the Isle of Serpents, and then what is the world setting that I would need to put at the start of my video on that chapter? What's the main theme of Greyhawk, or isn't there one?
Well, it changes because as the setting has existed and been added to, they've moved the timeline forward. So it started in the year 576 in the setting, and that was the folio and the gold box. That's the one that a lot of people use as their basis, and the one I usually, if I'm restarting my campaign, that's the era I want to start in. And the reason for that is everything is in a state of strategic tension. There's a lot of good nations around. And they're menaced by growing evil nations and organizations and so forth. But good is fractured, evil is fractured, and there are forces that are actively trying to promote balance. And this is another thing that you see in the novels that he wrote, that there are literally, like the druids are actively promoting the idea of balance, so that if evil becomes ascendant, they will aid good, and if good becomes ascendant, they will aid evil, to keep the wheel turning, rather than letting any one of the alignments, even though it's good or lawful, come to power. And I love that idea. I love the idea that you have these strategic tensions between the different powers in the world, and because to my mind, that gives you the most storytelling opportunities. Because you have conflicts. They are relatively low level conflicts, but they're everywhere. You have the giants rising up in the west. You've got the Cambian Ayus in the north. You've got the Great Kingdom in the east, and they're at war with their neighbors who rebelled against them. There's a whole lot of stuff going on, but you still have that kind of overall sense of balance. Later on, they had an event called the Greyhawk Wars, where all of these tensions kind of blow up at the same time. And they used it to kind of reset the setting. This happened after Gary Gygax left the company. And they kind of wanted to move away from his concept of the setting. And at the time, I didn't care for it all that much. They moved the timeline ahead about 9 years, and a lot of stuff happened. Kingdoms were conquered and split up and so forth. But in retrospect, I think it works a lot better than I did at the time. And that's an era where you have evil is clearly ascendant. Ayuz has conquered most of the north. The Great Kingdom has exhausted its neighbors in war, and then broken up into a bunch of different little kingdoms. You have the Scarlet Brotherhood, which is this evil secret society, has risen to power in several different nations. So evil is definitely on the way up. So it changes the nature and feel of the setting, because now the PCs are struggling against the rise of evil rather than participating in the maintenance of balance. And then later on, they move the timeline up forward again, another 6 years. And it kind of brought the setting back to that sense of balance, where Ayuz was kind of pegged back just a little bit. The Scarlet Brotherhood was trimmed back a little bit. Things seemed to settle down in the Great Kingdom. The good realms are building themselves back up again after the wars. So you're kind of more attuned to that earlier setting, where things were in balance, but things feel a lot more fragile in that later setting. So you have these different things to choose from as a DM. Depending on the kind of game you want to run, there are different eras that you can choose from, and that will determine what the overall themes of the campaign are for you.
Right, I see. I know you mentioned about Tensor, people like that, of the floating disc spell, who was a player character in Greyhawk, and a lot of these big people were just player characters.
Exactly, they were player characters or NPCs. All of the most of the characters that you see with the named spells, Mordenkainen, Tensor, Otto, Autoluke, all those things are Melf. Was Luke Gygax's one of his characters. They were indeed actual player characters. And a lot of other player characters or henchmen from that original campaign ended up in modules and novels and stuff. So it's very much informed, and I like that a lot, because it gives a sense of real diversity to the characters, because if every character is written by the same person, it's not always the case, but it does tend to start to feel a little repetitive. But when you have 20-30 people participating in the creation of a character's personality and history and so forth, it really brings it alive in a way that I think a single author would struggle with.
Cool. So I know on the same video you mentioned your website and having free resources.
Yes.
What are we missing out here? What do I need to go delving into?
Well, if you go to greyhawkgrognard.com, you will not only find a whole over a decade's worth of articles that I've written, but there's also a free download section. And in there, I have a wealth of material for 5th edition, all sorts of different backgrounds and monsters and magic items, new spells, all kinds of stuff to run a 5th edition Greyhawk campaign. There's about 900 pages all told. There's also a bunch of stuff that is system neutral. Back in the 80s, I had mentioned that Gygax had done a series of articles in Dragon magazine about events in the Flanaess. He never got a chance to finish those, so I did. I finished them for him in something I call Dragon magazine, where I kind of make it look like the old Dragon magazines,
Nice.
but not quite, just to add to the sense of verisimilitude. Where it had, I've also done the Armies of Greyhawk. I've tried to expand the world of Greyhawk from its published form. I have stuff on the Backloonish people, which is kind of a kind of fantasy Arab world, which is up in the northwest. I've expanded to the south of the Sea of Dust, which is sort of an India, a fantasy India kind of setting. So I have the maps that match the maps that came in the original box. I have new classes and spells and monsters and a little bit of a gazetteer to explain all the kingdoms and so forth. So I kind of tried to carry forward a lot of Gary's stuff, but probably what most people are going to find most useful is that 5e Greyhawk material.
That sounds fantastic. I always watch your videos and see your little paint set behind you.
Yes, my painting station.
So have you got minis on there now?
I do actually. I'm in the middle of doing a bunch of minis to fight the Battle of Emerity Meadows, which is actually related to the Temple of Elemental Evil that I spoke about before. I've been posting them on my Facebook channel as I finish them up. And on the bench right now, I'm working on some dwarves. These are all 15 millimeter figures. and I'm using a rule set that I made up that's sort of an expansion of a D&D first edition for mass minis battles. So it uses kind of the assumptions regarding magic and classes and levels and so forth that first edition has, and kind of translates it into a mass war game.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
I also do a lot of Ogre, which is the old Steve Jackson game. I've got a ton of the. It's another minis war game. It's a science fiction game where one player has one giant cyber tank, and the other player has a whole bunch of tanks and hovercraft and infantry and stuff, and it's an even match. So I run that at conventions too.
Cool. Yeah, Steve Jackson was at that thing I went to recently as well.
Well, there's two Steve Jacksons.
Oh, it's not the
UK Steve Jackson. This is the Texas Steve Jackson. The guy who did what's it called? Illuminati and Munchkin.
Oh, Munchkin, I've heard of that. Yes.
Yeah, that's Steve Jackson game.
Heard of. You know, this quest from the infinite staircase. That's bringing back old things, isn't it? And is it called the Last Caverns of Soj Khan? Is it pronounced that way?
Oh yeah. Well, I've run it several times. It's one of those things. The Lost Caverns of Soj Khan is very interesting because one of the things that Gygax does in some of his modules, not all of them, is that there's a superficial front area, and you can go through it, and it's kind of not all that amazingly interesting. But there's one particular thing. If you find that secret door, or if you realize that that's an illusion and you walk through it, or whatever the thing is, then it opens up into this enormous other wonderland where all the cool stuff is. And Sojkanth is one of those kinds of modules. So is the associated module, the Forgotten Temple of Tharizdun, that Rob Kuntz heavily contributed to. And it's an interesting design aesthetic, and I can't imagine that his Castle Greyhawk, which obviously was the one of the granddaddies of all mega dungeons, that had to be something that you saw in there too, where like you'd go on a level. You'd clear out orcs and kobolds and whatever, and if you missed that one secret door, you missed out on all the fun stuff. But it also invites you to come back. A year later in game, you can say, that can't have been all there was there, or you use these spells, or a wand of secret door and trap detection, which when you're playing a game like that, where there are areas that you can suspect there are areas that are going to hide the good stuff, that magic item suddenly becomes a really important resource.
That's awesome. So with them bringing back in the DMG the Greyhawk setting, it sounds like that might be the start of just basically cheaply remaking old things. But also, if they've released that map that you made a video on, why would they change anything on it?
I can't know, and I've actually asked the guy who made the map about what year does it take place in, and he deferred. He's like, no, you'd have to wait for them to say something. He obviously didn't want to talk about stuff like that. But it's impossible to know what's going on in their heads and why they make certain decisions. But I think given recent history, it's pretty obvious that some of the changes that they made were made to accommodate modern sensibilities. Like they took away references to nomads and savages and things like that in the names of countries. They changed the name of Blackmoor to Arn, which is looks like a nod to Dave Arneson because Blackmoor was his setting, and Gygax used the name, and that could be because they wanted to avoid any trademark issues or whatever. They changed the Scarlet Brotherhood name to something else. It's like I say, it's impossible to know for sure, but it's easy to guess that they're doing it for modern audiences.
Yeah. Right. Last question. You must know some things that don't get spoken about. The lesser known things. What you really love about Greyhawk.
I love the fact that, especially the earlier stuff, but even the later stuff, it really rewards deep diving and trying to make connections. And I love that fact that it will, you can something that I've read untold numbers of times. And I read it again from a different angle, looking for something else, and all of a sudden, an entire new set of connections reveals itself. The fact that stuff is still in there and still waiting to be found, even in and amongst these really relatively brief descriptions of things, that these connections are still there. And Gygax's prose was so profoundly inspirational, and could encompass all these little nuances that are still in there waiting to be discovered. That's one of the things I really love about it, is that it so rewards in-depth analysis. I love that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. All links to Joe's stuff will be in the description, obviously, and we're all looking to see where your knowledge takes the new knowledge and how it combines.
Well, I'm hopefully positioning myself so that my stuff will be helpful and welcoming to all the new people who are going to be finding Greyhawk because of the new DMG and the other books. So, I'm a gamer. I'm a Greyhawk fan. I'm a fan of the setting, and I want to help it, and I want to help the community.